Welcome, friends. Welcome. Yes, thank you for welcoming me, Miguel. Appreciate that. Hello, everyone. If you'd take a seat. We're going to begin the panel now, and as we do, you're invited, if you get thirsty or hungry, to pop up and get something else to eat. That's just fine. But we'll finish the panel in time to resume the reception. So we'll all be done by 7:30, and you'll be able to eat twice tonight. This is a special night for me. We have 3 very big retirements from the School of Theology faculty this year, and this is the only one of the events where I'm actually in town. The other times I'm overseas. Unfortunately, it's on the time when I'm actually organising it, so I'm very sorry to Professor Hart and Professor Emmerman for being away on their celebration nights. Look for them, they will be fun. So glad you came out tonight. And my job is to interview, sorry, I'm not going to interview, that was a joke. I'm going to introduce everyone, but before that I'd like to tell you what the scope of the evening's panel is. There's lots of things you can do when approaching someone like Robert Neville. From the time he was a child organising the local baseball team until being the Dean of Marsh Chapel, he's led every single administrative unit that he's ever been in. Even when those administrative units have no more use for him and move on to other people, he still has this enormous record of institutional care from the time he was little until now. We could be focusing on that, but we're not. He's also a churchman, and for people in the School of Theology, this is a significant fact about him. He's a Methodist minister, he's served Methodist churches, and throughout his career, he's been keen to relate the academic life to the realities of the church. We're not going to talk about that either. He's a scholar and an author. He's written an enormous number of books, and I'm about to take you through every single one of them in great detail. That's our focus for this evening. We're focusing on his academic work, and we have a marvellous panel here to speak about this. Now, we know the audience here is not philosophers. There are a few philosophers here, thank goodness, but most of you are not. And so the people on the panel are presenting their thoughts in ways that should be accessible to a general humanities audience, except Miguel here, who will attempt to baffle you with Persian rubbish. No, with... Now, let me just tell you something about the history. If I talk like this, can you hear me okay? Yeah, we're good? All right. I'd like to tell you something about the history of Bob's works. The first one was this. This contains a truly original metaphysical argument defending creation ex nihilo, which in his sense is very, very different than it was in the tradition. It's pretty much the only innovative move in the doctrine of creation since the Reformation. It was followed by this book, which got him in trouble with the Process crowd because it criticises them and they've never forgotten it. Now then, there's a whole bunch of other books, and they're just in classes, they're in groups. One group is the sermons. Now, these sermon books are very interesting. They're not all here. He has another one as well, I believe. But they show the sort of work that he did as a preacher in the course of his life. And then, especially important, is this set of books, which are substantive books, standalone books. There's The Truth of Broken Symbols, Eternity and Time's Flow, The High Road Around Modernism, where he defends something other than postmodernism as a way to understand our contemporary situation, Symbols of Jesus, which is a kind of Christology, and The Scope and Truth of Theology. These are books that complete a system which has been presented in something that is truly unique. The truly unique part of Robert Neville's publishing are 2 trilogies, both of them essentially systematic philosophies. No one has ever produced 2 systematic philosophies, for the main reason that They're not supposed to change their mind. There's just supposed to be one thing to say if you're a systematic philosopher. So this is the first set here. And this lays out, it's called the Axiology of Thinking series. It lays out an interpretation of human thinking, of human life, of human understanding in axiological fashion. That is, with sensitivity to the values, the value structures, the dynamics of value change in the world. It's extremely creative and interesting. But just recently, he completed a second trilogy, which is the Philosophical Theology, Ultimates, Existence and Religion. And this now is his equivalent of a systematic theology. Now, as a naturalist, as a pragmatist philosopher, as a philosopher of religion, there are people in the world who write systematic theologies who would not recognise these as systematic theologies, but here at Boston University, we don't have any questions about that kind of thing. Now, these books, believe it or not, have not sold very well. They're extremely technical, so it takes us to this set of books. These are the sets of essays. These are books made from occasional pieces, rewritten and coordinated in such a way as to create a unified theme, and marvellously diverse. There's Boston Confucianism, which is the only religious movement ever founded by a Methodist, apart from Methodism. Religion in late modernity, and realism in religion, another attack on those crazy postmodern people, I guess. Ritual and Deference, The Tao and the Diamond and The Puritan Smile are two best-selling books, I believe. And notice all the way through the incredible artwork. Now you may think you had no idea that Bob Neville, in addition to everything else, was a fabulous artist, but you'd be mistaken if you went in that direction. These are all Beth Neville's artwork, and she's illustrated. She's illustrated all of these books. Look at these covers. Absolutely gorgeous. These are pencil. The level of detail and creativity that's gone into this is amazing. Now, they're books. There's this one other I want to talk to you about. This is the worst theology primer ever written. The reason for this is not because there's anything in here that's wrong. It's just that it's the toughest introduction to theology you could ever imagine. It's a really, really difficult book. So there's a lot to laugh about, isn't there? But the thing about Bob is he's very quick to laugh about himself as well. A whole other dimension of Bob's life are the virtues that he's cultivated in the course of his life from a young child until today. And they're virtues of loving kindness, they're virtues of respect, and especially they're virtues of supporting young people who are striving to create a career not unlike his own. And he's been faithful to those people, he's dedicated himself to them, and those people include me. It's been the great good fortune of my life to arrive here, an expert in William James, a philosopher of religion, to discover that there's someone here who's expert in the other pragmatists, and that I was able to deepen my understanding of the pragmatic philosophical tradition by taking his classes in the first 2 years when I was here as a professor. An amazing experience to be nurtured by Bob all these years, through the tenure process, through the promotion process, through working on research projects together and publishing books together. It's been an amazing journey, but really it's just a token of the nature of his commitment to young people of every kind, many of whom are in this room here tonight. So this other side of Bob, it's intangible, it's impossible to quantify, and it's incredibly powerful. There are so many people around the world who love him and remember everything that he did for them, and this never changes for them. It's like a pillar in their lives, and they refer back to it forever. That's what it's like for me, that's what it's like for some of you, and all of us have been profoundly privileged to have him as a colleague. Now, it's good to pause, I suppose, before we introduce the panel. Now, they're going to speak for about 12 minutes each, The first speaker is Michael Raposa from Lehigh University, who's in the Department of Religion Studies. Not religious studies, that would be kind of suspicious. Religious studies? No, religion studies. They're very particular about that, so I wanted to emphasize it so he knew that we loved him and cared about him, and so grateful that he made the trip up from Pennsylvania. He's going to be talking to us about praying the ultimate, reading and rereading Neville's philosophical theology. And I'll introduce each of the other speakers as we go along. Thank you, Miguel.
Thank you, Professor. I'm going to be quoting Bob a lot in snippets, and so I'll either use bunny ears or deepen my voice to suggest keep it seamless. I'm grateful beyond words to have the opportunity to participate in this celebration of Robert Neville's work and career. I encountered Bob for the first time through his published work when, as a 21-year-old undergraduate, trying to write my senior essay at Yale College as a critique of process theology, I wandered into the pages of his first book on God the Creator. Most recently, as I anticipated becoming a grandfather, I worked through the 3 volumes of philosophical theology, aspects of which will be the main focus of my attention here this evening. In between, during a period spanning 4 decades, there have been innumerable other reading experiences, always edifying and often inspiring encounters with many of the approximately 500 books, articles, reviews, and sermons that can claim him as their author. Even more precious to me is the recollection of all the personal encounters and conversations that I've had with Bob during the last 30 years. It was a proud moment for me when Lehigh University, where I have long been a member of the faculty, awarded Bob an honorary degree in 1993. Pride mingled with both love and deep gratitude when he presided over my daughter's wedding in the summer of 2015. I could go on and explain why I always address him as President Bob in my emails, but my task here today is to say something meaningful about Bob Neville's philosophical theology. I have only 15 minutes to do so, and now one of them is already gone. Rather than hover at 10,000 feet and try to provide a broad overview or a bare sketch of Bob's thought, I have decided to take the plunge, to focus my attention more narrowly while trying to illuminate as much of his philosophical theology as I can. This means lingering over volume 1 of Bob's trilogy on ultimates, to a greater extent than I do with either volume 2 on existence or volume 3 on religion. Within the context of that first volume, I intend to narrow my focus even further. Chapter 15 of volume 1, about praying the ultimate, is a remarkable tour de force, blurring the line between philosophical theology and a theology of the spiritual life in a highly creative and productive fashion. Now, this chapter is one of the many places in his trilogy where Bob proclaims what I call the gospel of indexicality. Among the 3 general types of signs that the American philosopher Charles Peirce classified in terms of their relationship to their object, the index is one that exists in a directly causal relationship, rather than resembling its object like an icon, or representing it by convention, like what Peirce called a symbol, although Bob uses symbol as a more general label for all types of signs. As such, an index directs our attention, often forcefully, to this or that particular thing, much as the contemplation of some effect, like a crater in the earth made by the impact of a meteor, might serve emphatically to remind us of its cause. For the purposes of philosophical theology, Bob identifies the index as being the most important of the 3 types of signs. Why is this so? On his account, the act of thinking ultimacy must be primarily a matter of paying attention, of, as he says, turning attention to the right thing. And it is the index that functions best to serve this purpose. But in order to make sense of such an account, it will first be important to explain briefly what Bob conceives as truly ultimate. No simple task, since his meditation on ultimacy has itself extended over several decades. Religion is all about ultimacy on Bob's analysis, about the multiple ways in which human beings engage ultimacy, and also about the symbols that we use for the purposes of such engagement. Here, Bob chooses to follow someone like Paul Tillich, who identified religion with ultimate concern, rather than numerous other thinkers who have proposed concepts such as the sacred or the holy as being most crucial for the task of understanding religious belief, experience, and practice. Yet Bob's philosophical treatment of ultimacy is idiosyncratic and carefully nuanced. To some readers, perhaps even paradoxical on first inspection, since his metaphysics proposes that altogether there are 5 ultimates rather than 1. It's interesting to observe the title of his first volume of the trilogy appears in the plural, ultimates, and then upon typing it in this paper, my word processor spell check flagged it as an error by underlining it in red. On the more common understanding of what it means to be truly ultimate, there can only be a single such reality, and indeed for Bob, there is only one ontological ultimate, the primordial creative act that causes everything else to be, an act that is itself indeterminate, but is the ultimate source of all determinate things. In addition, however, Bob identifies 4 cosmological ultimate realities that come, as he says, from the determinateness itself and are relevant to human life. All determinate things have a form, they also have components, and existential location, and value. Each of these is a transcendental feature of the determinate created world, not just a feature of this or that particular thing or kind of thing, but rather a trait of everything that exists, what Bob refers to as a boundary condition for everything in the world. While these 4 are, in quoting, real ultimate conditions that every human being in every culture must face, nevertheless, the ontological creative act is the ultimate reality on which all other ultimate realities depend. Without wanting to appear like I am evading the challenge of interpreting Bob's highly subtle and original theory of cosmological ultimacy, for the present purpose of understanding what Bob means when he talks about praying the ultimate, it is this indeterminate creative act that deserves our special attention. Since the ultimate as creative act is indeterminate, it has no nature, no properties, nothing can be said about it in itself, apart from what it determines in the act of creation. It is a creative act rather than a personal creator, one to which we cannot legitimately assign agency, intentions, or purposes. And so this is the question that I want most especially to emphasize in my brief remarks today. In the act of thinking ultimacy, or of praying the ultimate, how does one go about the task of turning attention to the right thing? Since the ontological creative act is not any kind of thing at all, to what, where, or whom should attention turn? Moreover, what constitutes a right turn from a wrong one? How would either a philosophical theologian or a spiritual devotee discern the difference? I want to suggest that Bob's answer to this sort of question is an essentially pragmatic one. But since pragmatism is a fuzzy label for a broad range of philosophical perspectives, I want to be careful to explain what I mean in saying this. The ultimate reality cannot be engaged in any way on Bob's account that is not somehow symbolically mediated. There is no direct, unmediated access to the ultimate. Moreover, the sign or symbol that is most useful for this purpose, as already indicated, is the index, which does not so much convey information about the ultimate reality as it does direct attention to it, thus facilitating our engagement with that reality. On Bob's view, such engagement is a causal relation established by the index between its object and interpreter in such a way that, 1, part of what is valuable in the object is carried over into the interpreter, and 2, as a result of this engagement, the interpreter is somehow significantly transformed. The truth of such a symbol will be a function of the value that is communicated from its object to its interpreter. It will have virtually nothing to do with the picture or description of the object that the symbol supplies for its interpreter. Moreover, such truth will be measured by the way in which, as a result of this mediated engagement with the ultimate reality, the interpreter is subsequently transformed. Any symbol that is purported to represent ultimate reality by virtue of resembling it, like an icon, is of necessity literally false. Bob repeats this in his philosophical theology over and over again like a mantra. To think otherwise is to run the risk of idolatry. Yet any sign that is iconically false, he argues, might be indexically true if it carries over into the interpreter what is really valuable or important in its object. What is at stake here? An icon cannot accurately represent the ultimate reality. No symbol can do that. For Bob, as for Tillich, all religious symbols are broken. Bob is at his very best in these pages when he writes as an apophatic theologian, a theologian of mystery, and speaks with a strong prophetic voice. Nothing, he insists, can be known about the ultimate reality apart from the inexplicably free and arbitrary act as creator of all that is determinate. Even metaphors are problematic, because while they are taken to be literally false, they still assume some likeness between symbol and object. There is no such likeness. Bob's ultimate reality as ontological creative act is just about as wholly other as you can get. He does make brilliant use, I think, of Duns Scotus's argument about the universality of being, while rejecting theories of analogy. That is to say, there is one indeterminate sense of being that supplies unity for all of the multifarious determinate things that exist. Yet the ultimate reality, let's just call it God for the heck of it, that he identifies as the source of such unity has no nature of any kind, no qualities or character at all, apart from creation. So all of our religious symbols fall short of representing the ultimate and must represent either nothing or something else. Either nothing at all or something else. What else? Theological and religious discourse, if it is about anything at all in Bob's view, is about, and again I quote, the symbolic engagement of the interpreter with the interpreted, shaped and guided by means of the interpreting signs. As Bob insists, the real object of symbolic engagement is involved in the engagement. Moreover, in the process of such engagement, the interpreter is in some sense constituted as a causal product of the object, thus gradually transformed by that object. All that is required is that the interpreter pay proper attention. This is what Bob means by praying the ultimate. Let's talk a little bit about the nature of this transformation. Bob suggests that the ultimate reality will enter this engagement primarily as something felt. And how is it felt? As the master grounding component of a certain kind of religious experience. And what is the result of this experience? Attunement to ultimate realities so that we can discriminate how we should comport ourselves toward them. Finally, what constitutes such an attunement? From Bob's distinctively pragmatic perspective, it must be our practices that manifest the true meaning of any particular religious symbol. It is only through practice that religious virtuosity, as Bob portrays it in each of the 3 volumes of his trilogy, can be achieved. Such individuals, as a result of continuous practice, a lifetime of praying the ultimate, are able to turn themselves into signs, thus becoming properly attuned and now embodying the engagement of ultimacy as a habit. Bob's ultimate reality displays creative force, but has no qualities, no nature, no name, no intentions. We ought ideally to pay attention to the ultimate without painting pictures of it or telling stories about it. Well, perhaps it's better to say we should not allow these pictures or stories to distract us from the reality of it. Once again, that reality is more readily felt than conceived or described. Last page. Because of it, we exist. So one of the things that we should feel as a result of engagement with the ultimate is a profound sense of gratitude. Return briefly now to my original question and dilemma. Since the ontological creative act is not this or that, not any kind of thing at all, there can be no determinate it to which one attends in praying the ultimate. This suggests that at the end of the spiritual day, our indices are rendered as broken as our icons. This also makes the nature and quality of the attention that Bob's theology demands really something quite extraordinary. Such attention might best be described as a form and habit of readiness, a kind of waiting, but not for anything in particular. I think that what Peirce called musement is a practice of paying attention in just this fashion, and Bob's discussion of the various spiritual paths in chapter 16 of volume 1 has Peircean echoes everywhere. The purpose of amusement for Peirce was exactly as Bob reports, to make the meditative engagement of ultimacy a habit. Its aim was precisely to attend to the things of creation such as they are, without practical purpose or bias. For Peirce, as well as for Bob, traveling the spiritual path eventuates in a kind of falling in love with the ultimate, and then culminates through disciplined practice in one's becoming an adept lover. This is a love that should make one feel grateful, as already suggested, but as Bob further explains, it should also result in certain feelings of delight. Delight, always followed by gratitude, is what it feels like to be habitually in love with God. And so at the risk of idolatry, I want to conclude by saying that both delight and gratitude represent my typical response to Bob Neville's work and thought whenever I carefully engage it. These are most certainly the feelings I have being with him and all of you here tonight in Boston. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Our second speaker this evening is Bin Song, who is Assistant Professor of Philosophy and Religion at Washington College. Now, those of you who know Bin Song know that he's a PhD student here who's about to walk in May. This is a major appointment for a tenure-track position. We're extremely proud of him. And he's going to talk to us about Neville on comparative theology and the Christian-Roux dialogue, where Roux is Confucianism. Thank you, Bin.
Thanks for having me here. In 2013, when I finished my visiting scholarship in Harvard Yinjing Institute and decided to stay in the US to study Confucianism and comparative theology of religion, it is mainly the so-called school Boston Confucianism which attracts me. During my doctoral studies, Professor Wesley retired just before the beginning of my doctoral program. Professor Du Weiming, a famous Confucian scholar from Harvard, has gone back to Beijing, and as a result, Professor Neville remained the only active scholar in the School of Boston Confucianism. Even so, in recent years, under the supervision and the promotion of Professor Neville, and with the help of his other doctoral students, such as Brother Larry, Dr. Yair Lior, we Boston Confucians actually become stronger. We built the first college student organization of Confucianism in the US, titled Boston University Confucian Association, which received a significant amount of donation and sponsorship from both from the US and from China. And we continually hosted scholarly lectures, workshops, and conferences every semester. So, Dr. Neville, although you will retire, the school you are pioneering becomes even stronger. But the marvelous thing about Dr. Neville and his school of Boston Confucianism is that actually Dr. Neville does not speak Chinese. And Chinese is hardly counted as his major research language. I clearly remember that Dr. Neville once joked to me about his presence in an annual celebration of Confucius' anniversary back to the city of Qufu, which is Confucius' home state. In China, he said, although I participated in the ritual, I was the only Confucian there who does not speak Chinese, and the people there also do not know that. Believe me, this is not a joke. It actually speaks to the heart of the project so-called Boston Confucianism. The heart of Boston Confucianism is explained clearly in the subtitle of its foundational text. In 2000, Dr. Neville published the book Boston Confucianism, and its subtitle is Portable Tradition in the Late Modern World. So how to uproot the Roux tradition, carry it over, plant it, and let it grow in North America in the 21st century is the central concern of Boston Confucianism. And this central motif also naturally connects to the topic of my presentation today, Dr. Neville of Comparative Theology and the Christian-Roux dialogue. If I have to use one simple answer to the question why, to answer the question why Dr. Neville believes the root tradition can transcend language barriers and become portable, that is because the tradition speaks to something true. For Dr. Neville, in his most strict definition of theology, the term comparative theology is just a tautology. It's redundant, since for him, theology must be based on comparative basis, which means if some statement on ultimate matters of human life is true, it must be true across traditions. In Neville's understanding, this is also the original meaning of the Christian term evangelical. To be evangelical is to study, discover, experience, and spread truth to all the people. By the same token, we must also change our traditional understanding of inter-religious dialogue and try to grasp what these terms mean for Dr. Neville's practice of the Christian root dialogue. It is actually not a dialogue when two groups of people come together with their clearly defined religious affiliation or spiritual identity and then talk to each other. No, this is not the case. From an individual perspective, Neville's Christian root dialogues is instead a self-generative and ever-growing monologue, where Neville continues to elicit resources from both the Christian and the root tradition to ascertain truths on ultimate matters of human life. During the process, the boundaries of identities melts, and the territories of traditions becomes porous. In Neville's words, his magnificent 3-volume project of philosophical theology is no more Christian than Confucian, quote. And he also warmly endorses the practice of multiple religious identity. Nevertheless, after explaining why Dr. Neville believes Confucianism can become Bostonian, I have to emphasize another side of Dr. Neville's understanding of theology and inter-religious dialogue. For many years, Dr. Neville's title on his faculty webpage remains Professor of Philosophy, Religion, and Theology. Another joke that is indelible to my memory at Neville's classroom is that he told us the reason why he is a professor of 3 disciplines is that he had never figured out the difference of the 3. However, through his writings and my personal interaction with him, I can figure out that one major difference between philosophy and religion that Neville cares about is that in religion, you cannot just think and argue. You must also do something. You must chant, meditate, perform rituals, practice Tai Chi martial arts, carry breakfast tables in mass temple, help people, make your hand dirty and muddy, and so forth. In Neville's term, in every religious symbol, there is not only an abstract theological aspect of it, there is also a material aspect of it, speaking to the symbol's intimacy to actual human experience in a particular culture and communal context. Therefore, in order to do theology comparatively, we do not only need to read text across traditions, we also need to participate in community life across boundaries. One consequence of this Nevillian insight is certainly the creation of Boston University Confucian Association, and its main organizer, me, is actually a part-time chaplain of Mass Temple. I also regularly read the Gospel of John on the podium to Bostonians, usually before Dean Hill's sermon. In a word, using my best effort, a Boston Confucian today, under the inspiration of Dr. Neville's founding works, will be defined as a learned and kind human person with 2 central features. 1, he or she needs to be versed in the root tradition, as well as at least one other world tradition, so as to do philosophy, religious studies, and theology comparatively. And 2, he or she needs to be dedicated to people's community life, so as to help to strengthen the solidarity and the open-mindedness of the communities, with an ultimate concern to bring truth and harmony to all under heavens. If they can speak Chinese, that's extra. Otherwise, they can still pass. In this celebratory mood, I would like to end my presentation with one quote from one Neo-Confucian thinker, Lu Jiuyuan, who lives in 1139 to 1192. He's also a contemporary to Zhu Xi, the most the famous synthesizer of the Neo-Confucian tradition. So when talking about how the Ru tradition is committed to universalism and to an all-encompassing harmony of human civilization, Lu Jiuyuan once famously said, quote, "If a sage rising along the Eastern Ocean, this heart remains the same and this principle keeps the same." Heart is the Chinese term xing, the capacity of consciousness which can know principle and internalize ethical criteria and ontological principle in a process of self-cultivation. So I will begin to quote, repeat the quote. "If a sage rising along the Eastern Ocean, this heart remains the same and this principle keeps the same. If a sage rising along the Western Ocean, this heart remains the same and this principle keeps the same. If a sage rising along the Northern and Southern Ocean, this heart still remains the same and this principle still keeps the same. If there was a sage born hundreds and thousands of generations ago, this heart remains the same and this principle keeps the same. If there will be a sage born in hundreds and thousands of generations later, this heart still remains the same and this principle still keeps the same." Today, if we count 10 years as one generation, after Lu Jiuyuan, there indeed have already been 100 generations past. And Dr. Neville was indeed born along the Western Ocean and in the Western world. In Dr. Neville's works, do we not witness the same heart and the same truth that are supposed to be shared by all human beings? Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. From a PhD student who has gotten a job to a PhD student who's writing his dissertation, I'm introducing David Rohr. He's a PhD candidate in the Graduate Division of Religious and Theological Studies. He's going to be speaking to us on "By Their Fruits Ye Shall Know Them, Neville's Pragmatic Account of Religious Truth." And while you're organising yourself, I'll just point out that this is an example of what happens when the generations change. Robert Neville, a good philosopher, would never think of showing projected anything. It's like an appalling concept. But the younger people actually find it useful to have diagrams to present ideas. So this is an attempt to rehabilitate Robert Neville from his resistance to new technology in all of its forms. So we're indebted to you, David, for that effort. It will completely fail.
Thank you. Thanks for that vote of confidence. I just want to say first, being Bob Neville's student has been one of the great honors of my life, and I feel very, very excited and honored to be here today and to be on this panel with three brilliant thinkers. Okay, by their fruits ye shall know them. Neville's pragmatic account of religious truth. Bob Neville is an extremely systematic thinker, but in order to do any justice to his philosophical and theological system in an hour, our only feasible strategy has been divide and conquer. My responsibility is Neville's theory of religious symbols, interpretation, and truth, but I must warn you that I cannot be comprehensive in 15 minutes. For those seeking a comprehensive account, that you buy and read Bob's books, beginning in this case with The Truth of Broken Symbols, Symbols of Jesus, and the 4 volumes of collected sermons. Instead of struggling in vain to be comprehensive, my goals for this presentation are twofold. To explain via PowerPoint the basics of Charles Peirce's semiotic theory, and to provide a broad overview of Neville's fruitful application of Peirce's semiotics in his theory of religious interpretation. So, beginning with the PowerPoint. The basic idea in Peirce's conception, in his semiotic theory, is the idea of semiosis, which just means sign interpretation or sign translation. And semiosis consists of a triadic relationship between 3 things: a representing sign, a represented object, and an interpreting interpretant. The sign mediates between the object and the interpretant. It represents the object to the interpretant, and the interpretant interprets the object on the basis of the sign. So that's all abstract, but here's a concrete example. You wake up in the morning, you see dark clouds, that's a sign, you take it as representing the likelihood of a storm, and you bring your umbrella. That's the interpretation. Okay? My wife hands me a grocery list. It's a sign, it represents the things she wants from the grocery. The interpretation is I go to the grocery, I buy the things she wants, and I have a happy wife. Okay, now I want to talk about these three arrows here, three relations involved in semiosis. The first is significance, and significance is a sign's capacity to represent its object. It's what makes a sign a sign. And Peirce recognized three main types of signs. The first being an icon, which represents its object via likeness or similarity. So for instance, this squiggly arrow lets you know that the road ahead is curvy, right? The squiggle is like the road ahead. An index is a sign that represents its object via a causal relation. So for instance, a weather vane represents the direction of the wind because it's actually caused by the direction of the wind. And a symbol represents its object via convention or code. So every word on this page is a symbol, all words are symbols, a traffic light is a symbol, there's nothing intrinsic in red, yellow, and green that represents what it does, it's just a convention. And likewise, pretty much all religious symbols are, all religious signs are symbols. They have their meaning by being embedded in wider symbol systems. Okay, the second relation is representation, and representation is significance communicated to an interpreter. So a sign is significant prior to interpretation, but it isn't functioning as a sign unless it's representing an object to some interpreter. And the third relation is interpretation. So an interpretant is a translation of the sign. It expresses and typically expands the meaning of the sign. And interpretants are typically practical, concrete engagements of the object that trust the sign's representation. Now I'm going to say a couple of very simple things about pragmatism, connecting it to semiotics. The crudest way to say it is that Peirce's pragmatism asserts that our symbols are inextricably bound up with our bodies, that their very meaningfulness depends upon their capacity to inform or organize habits or general patterns of practical engagement. And this has a couple important consequences, including that human symbols are representations for practical engagement, and their meaning is firmly tethered to our vulnerable bodies. And Williams James makes this point by saying, human motives sharpen all our questions, human satisfactions lurk in all our answers, and all our formulas have a human twist. And the second point is that the basic context for interpretation is that needy organisms are struggling to adapt themselves in a fecund yet dangerous environment. And Dewey expresses this by saying, life goes on in an environment, not merely in it, but because of it, through interaction with it. At every moment, the living creature is exposed to dangers from its surroundings, and at every moment, it must draw upon something in its surroundings to satisfy its needs. Okay, and now here's some signs to think about while I keep talking, in case you get bored. Okay, Bob Neville was the first serious student of Peirce's semiotics to systematically apply that theory to the study, analysis, and theory of religious symbols and interpretation. Peirce thought that semiotic inquiry naturally divided into three sub-inquiries, focused upon signs, signs' relations with their objects, and signs' relations with their interpretants. Neville's theory of religious symbols follows this logical division, studying and analyzing religious symbols and symbol systems, what religious symbols refer to and how they refer, and the context in which religious symbols appear in actual interpretations. The remainder of this essay discusses Neville's contributions to each sub-inquiry, focusing especially on the topic of religious interpretation and truth. Neville's books analyze a great breadth of religious symbols, including linguistic symbols like scriptures, commentaries, sermons, hymns, prayers, theological treatises, and theological concepts like Tao, being itself, and Nirguna Brahman, as well as nonverbal symbols, including ritual elements like Eucharistic bread and wine, the bitter herbs of the Seder meal, holy places and times, architecture, music, and paintings. In addition to great breadth, Neville provides extremely deep analysis of particular symbols and symbol systems, most notably Jesus and the Eucharist. His deep analyses of these complexly layered symbol systems are invaluable contributions to both semiotic theory and Christian theology. Because a sign is defined by its capacity to represent its object, it follows, in Neville's words, that, quote, only by distinguishing a class of religious reference is it possible to say in any more than a conventional form what makes a symbol religious. How we strange primates are able to refer to something as obscure as ultimate reality is a perplexing question, one which Neville addresses in detail. Explaining his account of theological reference would require too much time and too much metaphysics. Instead, I'll simply note that its most remarkable feature is its realism. Neville posits that the creation is actually ontologically contingent, and that this contingency provides the fundamental basis for rightly referring to God or ultimate reality. In my opinion, Neville's richest and deepest contributions have been to the third sub-inquiry concerned with the interpretation of religious symbols. In what follows, I'll highlight the semiotic, pragmatic, and normative aspects of Neville's account of religious interpretation and truth. We begin with Neville's general definition of truth. Truth consists in the carryover of value from the object interpreted into the interpreting person or community in the respects in which the sign represents the object as qualified by the biological, cultural, semiotic, and purposive nature of the interpreters. Implicit in this definition is Neville's axiological realism, or his view that the object possesses real value, which interpreters can get right or wrong, a topic Professor Frankenberry will address shortly. As newly minted experts, you surely notice that Neville's definition of truth reflects Peirce's triadic conception of semiosis. Value is carried over from the object, through the sign, and into the interpreting person or community. Unlike theories of truth that only emphasize the correspondence between the sign and the object, Neville's Peircean account of truth also requires that the sign bring the truth about the object home for some interpreter. The pragmatic dimension of Neville's definition is expressed in his list of qualifications. Religious symbols cannot be true unless their truth is translated into the flesh and blood of actual interpreters, with their ancient biological heritage, rich cultures, and practical purposes and pressing needs. In Neville's words, the religious object needs to be transformed to the stuff of the interpreter's experience and life. Religious symbols and their interpretation are activities of people with meat brains, not computers or angels. Each of these qualifying factors is important, but I want to focus on culture, which is especially crucial. Neville observes that, quote, when the symbols of a given religious tradition are fresh and living, people see through them to the divine. But in the present theological situation, affected by the secular skepticism of modernity and the present vivid encounter of different religious traditions with one another, the religious symbols are always problematic. In addition to skepticism and awareness of the richness of other religions, traditional religious interpretations are also rendered problematic by modern scientific understanding of the cosmos and by our historical awareness of the all-too-human origins of religious texts and traditions. Given these profound interpretive challenges, the qualifications of culture often amount to total disqualification. Traditional interpretations of religious symbols simply cease to engage or inspire many contemporary people. In such situations, religious traditions must either reinterpret central symbols so that their truth speaks meaningfully to contemporary interpreters, or risk joining the dustbin of history, which is filled with no longer interpreted religious symbols and dead religions. Neville has worked tirelessly to reinterpret for modern people both Confucian and Christian symbol systems. The normative dimension of Neville's account of religious truth is apparent in the claim, that value is carried over from the object to the interpreter. What this carryover means can be seen by considering prior examples. I value the coming storm by bringing my umbrella. I value my wife's desires by buying the food she wants. But what does the carryover of value mean when the object represented is ultimate reality? The simplest way to answer is to review the criteria for excellent religious interpretation developed in philosophical theology. These 5 criteria correspond to the 5 things Neville thinks are ultimate. Lest you think he has added 2 persons to the Trinity, one of the 5 is ontologically ultimate and corresponds to God the Creator, while the other 4 are cosmological ultimates, or traits that define all created things. The latter include form, components that are formed, existential location relative to other things, and the value of getting those components together. The value of getting those components together into that form, in that location. In human life, these 4 ultimates manifest as universal predicaments that Neville thinks true religious symbols ought to help us address. The first predicament is that we need to integrate the components of our lives into some sort of whole. Our components include, trivially, the trillions of cells that make up our bodies and the complex systems that keep those bodies alive. But components also include our conflicting impulses, purposes, and ideals, and the competing responsibilities of our roles as child, partner, parent, employee, and citizen. Given this complexity, it is easy to become internally divided, acting at cross purposes with ourselves, or conforming to contradictory values in different contexts. Truthful religious interpretation should help us harmonize this complexity into a healthy, whole, and integrated life. Second, we need to relate rightly to the value of other people and things. This is easier said than done, especially in a world where one must kill to live. But we can eat thoughtlessly and wastefully, or mindfully and gratefully. Rather than being selfish, we should cultivate pious deference towards others. Truthful religious interpretation ought to deepen our appreciation for others, inspire us to struggle for justice, and when conflicts are irreconcilable, help us to love even our enemies. The third predicament is that we are being created in time and are ontologically obligated, I'm falling behind in my PowerPoint, and ontologically obligated to choose what we will be and do. All our choices are ambiguous, realizing one possibility while excluding all others, and we inevitably make many bad choices. So the first thing we need is courage to engage wholeheartedly in the struggle for righteousness. Truthful religious interpretation should supply moral courage, wisdom for discerning the best possibilities, and fortitude for persisting through failure. Fourth, we need to find ultimate meaning in life. We might not be great at getting our lives together, overcoming selfishness with love, or being wise and righteous choosers. Still, our lives achieve some positive value as we occupy our little corner of the vast cosmos. Truthful religious interpretation ought to help us, saints and sinners alike, to live with a sense of ultimate meaning and purpose. Finally, regarding the ontological ultimate, truthful religious interpretation should lead to ontological surprise, awe, and wonder. True religious symbols should confront us with the shocking fact of our being created, inspire mystical bliss, and produce deep gratitude and love for God. In sum, truthful religious interpretation orients interpreters to what is ultimately important, resulting in persons and communities who are filled with gratitude and love for God, who live healthy, integrated lives, who love unselfishly and struggle for justice, who engage the issues of their watch wisely and courageously, and who have a deep sense of the ultimate meaning of their lives. In conclusion, Bob Neville is an astonishing person, and increasingly so the longer you know him. As a seminary student, I was floored when he strolled into Theology 2 wearing a shiny sky blue disco suit and sang beautifully Tom Waits' Hobo Hymn down there by the train. When I got to know him years later, I was amazed at how thoroughly good, loving, and sage-like Bob really is. In rereading Bob's books, I find myself newly astonished by the multi-dimensional thoroughness of his theology. Most theologians don't produce philosophical theologies arguing for original conceptions of ultimate reality. Bob did that brilliantly 50 years ago. Very few theologians have developed sophisticated theories concerning how religious symbols actually work. Bob's theory of religious symbols and interpretation is probably the deepest and richest available. Even more remarkable, Bob has explicated his philosophical theology and applied his theory of religious interpretation while doing the dirty work of reinterpreting actual religious symbol systems, working heroically to help their ancient truths carry over into modern souls. Professor Song just told us about Bob's interpretation of Confucianism. Concerning Christianity, as Dean of Marsh Chapel from 2003 to 2007, Neville preached his way through the lectionary, providing us with a faithful, engaging, challenging, and beautiful interpretation of Christianity. In my opinion, Neville's Marsh Chapel sermons constitute a capstone to his theology of almost equal importance to the three-volume philosophical theology discussed by Professor Raposa. It is simply astonishing that one person could perform so well the roles of philosophical theologian, theorist of religious interpretation, and first-order interpreter of inherited religious symbol systems.
Dave.
Oh yeah, sorry.
Thank you. Well, if there was ever to be an instance of someone converting Bob to the value of PowerPoint presentations, I believe that might have been it. Thank you, Dave. Our final speaker tonight, before Bob gives a response, is Nancy Frankenberry. Now, I didn't say before that there have been at least two Festschrifts. The first of these was edited by Nancy Frankenberry and Harley Chapman, and a second one was later produced by some of Bob's students. It's an indication of, I think, his influence both on scholars and on students. And Nancy Frankenberry represents a friendship of enormously long years. The two of you have known each other for a long time. And so that is what we're hearing at the end here, this representation of this long distance view of a collegial relationship. Nezzy is John Phillips Professor in Religion, Emeritus at Dartmouth College, and she's going to be talking to us on the centre of Neville's vision, an elegant axiology.
Let me begin by thanking Dean Moore and members of the faculty of the Boston School of Theology for producing this event in honor of Bob Neville. I'm delighted to partake in it with you, with my fellow panelists, and with Bob, and with Beth Neville, his inspiration in life and art for 55 years. At the center of Bob's systematic philosophy is the Axiology of Thinking series. This is the key, I think, to his entire philosophy, in which he thinks axiologically at every turn in each new book in terms of the meaning and the foundation of value. This is also his philosophical cosmology. And while he has characterized it as the culmination of his early period, this is someone with at least 3 different periods, but they can be further subdivided. Calling it his juvenilia, it is anything but. It is widely regarded as a mature and systematic expression of Neville's constructive philosophical aims, much like T.S. Eliot's 4 quartets marks a mature meditation that shows the poet in full command of ideas, some mystical, mostly mystical, and language. Eliot divides each quartet into 5 sections, creating an effect similar to the musical form of a sonata. Neville divides his quartet into further 4ths, but condensed them into only 3 volumes, thus demonstrating the superiority of the philosopher's principle of parsimony to the poet's license to go on and on spiritual rebirth. The Axiology of Thinking is the work of a philosopher who is at heart a poet and also an architect. Neville thinks architectonically and in terms of quartets. The 4 quartets of axiological thinking are imagination, interpretation, theory, and responsibility. Each of these ways of thinking, and they are at root ways of thinking, modes of thinking, dimensions of human thought, involves valuing the object's thought in some sense or another, says Bob. We might wonder, what is it that we are doing when we create images or make interpretations or theorize using most often formal structures, or when we hold obligations? Among the many specific answers to that kind of question is the most general, all-encompassing answer that Neville spells out. We are valuing the object's thought about. Most generally, that is what we do in all the very, very specific ways in which we are thinking. Thinking is axiological. This remarkably simple hypothesis forms the foundation for the entire enterprise. But what does it mean to value something? The answer unfolds in a 4-fold fashion. As I've said, all Gaul was divided into 4 parts. Imagination, interpretation, theory, and obligation. These comprise the way in which, excuse me, the ways in which value is created, recognized, expressed formally, and responded to. Indeed, these 4 comprise the dimensions of thinking itself. Architect joins poet in designing the 3 volumes in which the 4 themes are played out. You have only to catch the rhythm in order to follow the trajectory of Neville's thought, not only through that first trilogy, but through all the intervening books that offer further subject matter specifications of what is so beautifully and architectonically laid out in that first trilogy. So look first, or look again, those of you who have studied and reread the trilogy lately. Look first in the first section of each chapter of each of the 3 volumes, then in the subsequent divisions, and watch as they move from phenomenological familiarity to ever more detailed analytic elaboration in the next 3 sections. This is the rhythm of Neville's 3 books: the reconstruction of thinking, recovery of the measure, and normative cultures. They all move in much the same rhythm. Bob himself gives us the crib sheet to show how we simpletons might read his architectonic achievement more simply. So in referring to volume 1, he invites us to squint. And squinting, we can, quote, observe that in each chapter, the next section is an imaginative phenomenology, end quote. And the general reader, or simpletons like us, can, or those of us who are short of time, can read just the very first section in each chapter and still derive a coherent account of the book's presentation, of the problems ingredient in reconstructing our thinking, and of the positive suggestions that Bob is making. In other words, I'm inviting you, or he's inviting you, besides squinting, to read across each chapter, the very first introduction, not down, but across. The more interpretation you want, the more theory you are interested in, the more responsibility you want to pursue, read down through chapters 3 and 4 for further depth, for more subtlety, for additional, sometimes tough detail and analysis. The rhythm of this architectonic structure, I'm mixing my metaphors here, the rhythm of the architectonic structure, trying to shake the foundations a little, reaches its apotheosis for me in this statement on page 324 of Reconstructing the Measure. Quote, "We never get at reality except through interpretation," Neville writes. "Yet this reality is the measure of our interpretations." One more time. I mean, I think this gets us out of what some have called unfairly the postmodern dilemma, and puts us exactly right. Quote, "We never get at reality except through interpretation, yet this reality is the measure of our interpretations." So far, I've been laying out the architectonic beauty of Neville's systematic philosophy. in order to provide a roadmap for your reading or rereading of those 3 volumes. But I want to attempt also a summation of the achievement that this trilogy represents. First, Neville has given us a theory of value. Value as found in nature. I don't have time to develop all the dimensions of his naturalism, but it's significant that the value that he is analyzing, probing, stacking up in systematic fashion is found in nature, not created by the human mind, not an invention or a construct or a convention. Second, he has given us a theory of nature that deals with space, time, and movement. Thirdly, he has given us a theory of intentionality, so that his idea of interpretation has romance in it, and his theory of interpretation has echoes of the pragmatist and the hermeneutical tradition. Fourthly, he has given us a theory about theories, a theory of theorizing that spans science and culture at once, and that addresses the problem of theorizing across different cultures. And he has given us a view of practical reasoning that integrates responsibility with Confucian ritual theory. By the end of the first volume, Reconstruction of Thinking, those 2 favorite heroes of modern philosophy, the Cartesian cognitive subject and the Kantian autonomous will, have been sent packing. And what emerges instead is an American pragmatist process philosophy enterprise, whose heroes are Charles Sanders Peirce, Alfred North Whitehead, John Dewey, and Robert Cummings Neville. Now I want to call your attention to 3, just 3 of the controlling ideas that appear in those volumes and that reappear in further Nevellian tomes. The first idea centers around the claim that there is a carryover of value from the object interpreted into the interpreter's experience in the respect in which the interpretive signs stand for the object. Notice that this is a dyadic carryover from object of experience in a relocation that makes something true of that object. So what happens at first as monadic becomes dyadic. It is a process at the monadic level as well as in a dyadic fashion of gathering together into a unity, of harmonizing elements of value, large or small, monads or relational entities. Asserting that the carryover does indeed carry over is what makes it triadic. So the carryover of value is then qualified, as Dave has beautifully laid out for us, 4 things: biological and purposeful factors, and cultural and semiotic ones as well. I have some doubts, just parenthetically, as to whether the word carryover is a poetic probe with real power or a beguiling solecism like the one my graduate school professor once wrote in the margin saying, "Please see my successful refutation of this point." But this is not the time to pursue that. The second idea that animates Neville's metaphysics and that appears as a linchpin in the trilogy is that of an ontological context of mutual relevance, OCD, no, OCMR. How do we explain the fact that things are together and yet different, and that their togetherness is not a mere aggregate, but genuine novelty? Neville says togetherness is ontological, finally. And a necessary condition of ontological togetherness is this context of, or a context of mutual relevance. Now another interesting question arises. Is that ontological context more ultimate than the things it unifies? Or are the things unified just as ultimate as the context of mutual relevance? I'm not sure what Bob Neville's answer is here. He thinks OCMR is the proper explanation for why there is value at all. But I wonder if any such explanation at such a high level of generality is possible. Certainly we can think at that level, but are we successfully explaining something at that level? Is that a correct use of the word explanation? Or whether any such explanation is required, I wonder. Which brings me to the third center of my interest in this trilogy. I want to defend the understandably vague character of Bob Neville's discussion, and incidentally, probably of my own commentary right now. Reality, after all, is infinitely dense, insistently particular, and everywhere contingent. How is the intellect ever able to speak of the world we live in terms of every determinate feature it exhibits? That, as I understand it, is Neville's ambition in the Axiology, just as his metaphysical ambition reaches to the level of covering any determinate thing. To cover all that ground, one can only employ a generic form of expression that is necessarily vague in the Peircean sense. So we begin with a bunch of things that are determinate with reference to one another and that are real by virtue of their being created together at that most abstract level of creation, according to Bob. Empirical inquiries, where some people think all the fun is, all the richness and all the color for philosophers, they are very important. They are important for specifying the categories more concretely, since vague categories of the highest level of generality can't dictate the contents of the world, only show us the forms that those things can take. So, having used both the architectonic image and the musical poetic image to describe Neville's work, I will now declare that I like him better as a musical maestro or a dance choreographer than as an architect in search of concrete foundations. But it turns out to be impossible to shave off Bob's foundational concerns, especially when the very first section of the very first volume of his trilogy bears the title Foundations. The foundation turns out to be the most important feature of the building, without which nothing is supported. For Bob, that foundation, as we've said, is the ontological context of mutual relevance. So Bob may insist that the notion that he has a foundation in any pejorative sense or is engaged in a foundationalist project is a great mistake, and that he intentionally omits what has been the singular characteristic of the foundationalist quest philosophically for ages, namely the quest for certainty. And we may recognize the difference there. But he wants a floor. Still, he wants a floor and a foundation. What's with this floor? And how is it compatible with Bob's distinguished reputation as a process thinker, a pragmatist, and a naturalist? I will leave that for him to state in the next trilogy. And for now, I salute you, Bob, in the words of T.S. Eliot in the Four Quartets, The Dry Selvages, not farewell, voyager, but fare forward.
Well, now it's time to hear from the man himself, who needs no introduction, I assume, or you wouldn't be here this evening. But I would like to thank Mary Elizabeth Moore and Audrey O'Neill for helping to arrange this evening's event, and thank you all for coming. Bobby's going to have the last word, and after this we can resume our eating and drinking and merrymaking. Thank you all for coming. Robert.
It's a little bit overwhelming. It's a whole lot overwhelming to speak after all of this. First of all, I do want to thank Mary Elizabeth for putting this together, and especially Wesley, who worked so hard to get everything organized so beautifully. I want to thank you all for coming. I'm shocked to find I have this many friends, but I'm very, very pleased for all that. There are, I don't know what to say about how I could have gotten a better set of panelists to talk about my work, and I don't have the time to respond to the details of what they've said. I do want to highlight a couple of things. Wesley and also David held up my books, arguing that you should buy them. That's really a good thing. Wesley, at the beginning, said that I've been involved in organizing things. I have been the academic head of whatever unit I was in, actually since 1966, and that was because it was the first academic unit I was in. I did other things. But I should say that for all the things that I've written of an academic scholarly sort, I've written more memos. And I'm sure Mary Elizabeth could appreciate the ambiguity that comes when your main output is writing administrative memos. One of the things that has helped me do this is having a kind of rigid architectonic mind that Nancy described so beautifully. I really appreciate the fact that she sees that in most of my books, of all the systematic ones, and in most of the essays and the collections of essays, the essays are divided into 4 parts. And the principle of the first part is a kind of phenomenological description of the problem. And the second part is about the theories that I'm going to disagree with. And the third part is the presentation of the theory. And the fourth part is kind of generalizing beyond that. And you can read across as well as up and down. I appeal to that kind of architectonic organization because life is so very complex. And all of that organization is false. Reality doesn't work that way, though perhaps learning works that way. Charles Peirce liked to distinguish between logika utans, the logic of useful thinking, and logika docans, the expression of that as doctrine in an organized fashion. And what I've tried to do is to hold on to things like dividing all topics into 4s as ways of bringing some order to things that then break the order. So the question that Nancy raises about foundations is very difficult and extremely complex. I have a theory about the foundation of determinateness. Why and how there's anything determinate and what that means. That's foundational, but it's a hypothesis. I've been writing about that for years and years and years, as if repeating it would make the hypothesis more plausible. I try to come at the hypothesis from different angles each time. And hopefully it does become more plausible. But I don't think that there's a foundation for thinking. At best, there's a conclusion for thinking. As you work through philosophical problems of these sorts that all four people have talked about, I think Michael Raposa was right to say that I've claimed from the beginning that to understand something is to be shaped by it as you interpret it, appreciating its value. Now, we often are wrong in our appreciations of value. What we value in something might not be what's really valuable there. And one of our common experiences is of learning that. We made a mistake in what we thought the value was. And the value of something is in itself, and it's also in how it affects other things. So as we increase or change the focus of the context of the values of things, we give different evaluations. And that means that what we thought were pretty clear categories turn out to be mere metaphors, and sometimes more mere than metaphorical. What Michael emphasized and everybody else said also in their way is that for me, thinking is to produce in the thinker a way of life that engages reality truthfully, in the sense of truth that's been discussed. That is, that our lives embody what's important, what's valuable in us. And when I talk about knowing ultimates, the ultimate realities, that's very important to me, because it means that we do in fact become prayers of the ultimate, as Michael said. It's the way we relate to the ultimates is embodied in the habits of our lives to varying degrees and in different contexts. So I learned this from Robert Brumbaugh, who was one of my teachers at Yale. I got my PhD in 1963, so you can remember, think about how long ago that was. A Platonic point, that the function of philosophy is to let us live better. And I've argued that to live better means to live with greater engagement. And it's the engagement with things with value, so sometimes how to be engaged is to be in opposition to what is on the ground. But it's complex and it is always changing. So Michael and the others have noted briefly that in the long run, not only are our iconic symbols broken, the way he put it, but also our indexical symbols are broken. So we're pointed to what's ultimate, but can our attention hold to what's ultimate? Now, my second trilogy is very long, small type, and in the very last volume, I entitled that fourth part of that volume, Religionless Religion. Now, I'm reasonably confident that nobody's going to read that far. I certainly don't want to undermine the enterprise to which I've devoted the last 30 years as a school of theology. It's supposed to be helping people to know more about and to become better at religion. But I think that this addresses Nancy's question of foundations. The foundation of our life is not what we know, although that certainly guides it. But I think is the courage to live with knowing and knowing that what you know is not quite right. So it's an existential matter of being able to accept the ambiguities and the final foundationlessness of things. To the extent that we, in fact, live out our engagements, our dialectical engagements with what's ultimate, to the extent that we do that, I don't think it matters much whether we are right or wrong. On the other hand, if you don't think about those things, you can't be right enough to be wrong in serious ways. And so I'm grateful for the career I've been able to have. I've generally been hired as an administrator, not as a thinker. That gave, since nobody paid attention to what I wrote, I could write whatever I want. And it turns out that it's this big complex thing to which people have testified here. I'm grateful especially to Boston University, which has given me the opportunity to live as a scholar official. I think that to live means that you minister to the social structures, the institutions that themselves relate to people. And I think I'm most proud of having survived from 1966, when I first became a department chair, until 2009, when I gave up my last administrative job here, as a scholar official. I've been blessed to be in administration, even though there are times when I complain about all the memos. I thought I was giving up all administrative work, but Michael Raposa, after I finished that, he was the head of the nominating committee for the Institute for American Religious and Philosophical Thought, and he got me to be president of that. Then he got me to be president of the Charles Peirce Society. And now I'm no longer either one of those. I think I'm retired. And I'll turn in grades for the last time in 3 weeks or so. But thank you very much for coming. I am moved beyond words. Well, actually, I've been talking for a while.